By 3:54 on a Sunday afternoon, the old family kitchen had settled into the kind of quiet that does not arrive all at once. It came slowly. A dish towel left near the sink. A cabinet door not quite closed. A few crumbs still on the kitchen island, catching the soft light from above. Outside, the street kept moving, tires passing over familiar pavement, a dog barking once, somewhere beyond the window. But inside, the room seemed to be holding its breath. The family photo frame sat near the edge of the island, close enough to touch, but not asking for attention. It was in that part of the kitchen no one usually photographed. Not the table set for holidays. Not the bright corner by the window. Just a small place under one soft light, where the room looked honest after being used. The visitor stood beside someone who said very little. There had been other rooms that week. Hallways. A nursing home chair. A paper cup of water. A name tag no one noticed. But here, in this kitchen, love felt older than words. The refrigerator hummed. And the photo stayed nearby. The frame had been there for years, though no one could quite remember who first placed it on the island. Maybe it had been moved from a bookshelf during one of those cleanups that begins with good intentions and ends with piles on every surface. Maybe someone had brought it down for a birthday dinner, meaning to put it back later. Or maybe it had simply found its place there, the way certain objects do in a family house, staying long enough to become part of the room. It was not a formal photograph. No studio background. No matching clothes. No careful smiles arranged under bright lights. Just a picture taken on some ordinary day, with people standing too close together, one person half blinking, another leaning out of the frame as if someone had called their name from another room. The visitor had seen that photo before. Not every time. Not closely. But enough to know the outline of it. The worn corner of the frame. The slight bend in the backing. The faint line of dust along the glass where someone had wiped around it instead of picking it up. That was how a family house held things. Not perfectly. Just faithfully. Beside the island, the quiet person shifted their weight but did not speak. Their hand rested near the counter, fingers loose, the skin thin in the afternoon light. There had been a time when those same hands moved quickly through this room. Opening drawers. Reaching for plates. Turning down the stove. Carrying grocery bags in from the car without making any announcement about the effort. So much of love had happened that way. Without language around it. The visitor knew that now in a way they had not always known it. At the nursing home, there were many kinds of silence. Some came from tiredness. Some from age. Some from the simple difficulty of finding the right word before the moment passed. There were residents who asked the same question twice, and families who answered gently the first time, then a little more tightly the second. There were rooms where television voices filled the space because no one knew what else to do with their hands. And there were pauses no one noticed. A visitor standing in a doorway for one extra breath. A daughter smoothing a blanket without being asked. A son looking at the floor because the face in the bed had become both familiar and strange. A staff member passing by with a cart of clean towels, carrying the day forward in small, necessary ways. Rarely did anyone stop and say thank you for the standing there. For the showing up. For the quiet return, week after week, even when the conversation had almost disappeared. But here, in the old kitchen, the visitor did not feel unseen in the same way. The room seemed to understand. It had known long stretches of unthanked care. It had held dinners made after work, lunches packed before sunrise, medicine bottles lined up near the sink, envelopes opened under bad light, and hands wiping the same counter again after everyone else had gone. The kitchen had been used hard. It showed. A nick in the island where something heavy had been dropped. A darker place in the wood near the edge. A chair pushed in at a slight angle, never quite square with the others. The refrigerator door had a tired seal, and when it closed, it made a soft pull, like the room taking something in and keeping it. The quiet person looked toward the photo. Not directly at first. More like their eyes had wandered there because the room had led them. The visitor followed that look and felt something small open in the chest. Not a revelation. Not a sudden understanding. Only a tenderness that came low and slow, the way afternoon light moves across a floor. In the photo, the younger faces were caught inside a day they probably did not think was important. Someone had cooked. Someone had arrived late. Someone had stood too close to the camera. Someone had maybe complained about having to take the picture at all. And still, there they were, held in a cheap frame on a kitchen island, years later, while two people stood beside each other saying almost nothing. The street outside kept going. A car passed. Then another. Inside, the refrigerator hummed in its patient way. The chores stayed half-finished. The towel stayed where it was. The frame held its little square of memory without explaining any of it. For a moment, the visitor did not reach for words. That felt like enough. There was something about standing beside someone in silence that made the whole house feel different. When people talked, the kitchen had a job. It held the conversation, the clatter, the little corrections, the questions about where things were kept. It made room for plates being stacked and drawers opening, for someone saying they were fine when they were only trying to get through the afternoon. But when the words fell away, the kitchen stopped performing. It became itself again. The visitor noticed the small places where the day had been interrupted. A sponge still damp near the faucet. A roll of paper towels leaning slightly to one side. Mail pushed toward the far end of the island, with one envelope opened and another still waiting. The kind of unfinished chores that made a home feel lived in, not neglected. Nothing was ready for company. Maybe that was why it felt true. The quiet person stood with one shoulder angled toward the island. Their gaze stayed near the frame now, resting there with a tired steadiness. Not searching. Not explaining. Just staying. The visitor had learned not to rush that kind of looking. At the nursing home, silence often made other people nervous. They filled it too quickly. They talked about the weather, the parking lot, the nurse who had come by earlier, the soup at lunch. None of it was wrong. Sometimes a small, ordinary sentence kept the room from feeling too bare. But sometimes the silence was the visit. Sometimes it was the only place where love could still sit down. The visitor knew the weight of that. Sitting near a chair. Standing beside a bed. Holding a paper cup while someone took one careful sip. Listening to a clock tick above a television no one was watching. Leaving with a feeling that nothing much had happened, then carrying that nothing through the rest of the day. It could seem small from the outside. It was not small. The photo frame gave the visitor somewhere to look without intruding. The glass caught a piece of the soft overhead light, and for a second the faces inside were partly hidden. Then the visitor shifted slightly, and the glare moved away. There they were again. A family gathered in the loose way families gather when no one knows, yet, what they will miss later. A shirt wrinkled at the sleeve. A hand resting on someone's shoulder. A face turned just enough to suggest another person had said something funny right before the picture was taken. The quiet person's mouth moved a little. No sound came. The visitor did not ask what it was. There were moments when asking could break something. Not because the question was unkind, but because some memories rose only halfway. They came as a smell, a color, the edge of a voice, the feeling of standing in a room before dinner. They did not always arrive with names attached. The refrigerator clicked once, then settled back into its low hum. That sound had probably been there for years, ignored by everyone who lived around it. It had held the background of homework at the counter, holiday mornings, late-night snacks, arguments that ended without apology, and the long quiet after guests left. It had hummed while people aged. It had hummed while children grew taller. It had hummed while someone washed dishes with tired hands and looked out at the street. The visitor listened to it now. It sounded almost like memory breathing. On the island, the frame stayed close to both of them. Close enough to belong to the present, old enough to hold the past. The visitor felt tenderness for the kind of love that had not always known how to speak. Love that came home with groceries. Love that fixed a loose hinge. Love that kept track of appointments, folded towels, saved receipts, cut fruit, checked the locks before bed. Not much was said about it then. Maybe not much could be said now. The quiet person lifted one hand and let it rest near the photo, not touching the glass. The visitor watched the space between the fingers and the frame. It was a small distance. It held a lot. Outside, another car passed the house. Somewhere down the block, a door shut. The world kept moving in its ordinary way, unaware of the pause under the kitchen light. Inside, the visitor stood still. For once, there was no need to make the silence easier. The visitor remembered how many times this kitchen had sounded different. Not brighter, exactly. Just fuller. There had been years when every surface seemed to carry a job. A grocery bag on the island. A casserole cooling under foil. A stack of school papers sliding toward the edge. Keys dropped hard near the mail. Someone looking for the good scissors. Someone asking whether the oven was off. The house had once answered with noise. Now it answered with light. Only one soft light above the island, lowered by the late afternoon, touching the frame, the counter, the quiet hand nearby. The rest of the room seemed to pull back a little, as if it knew this was not the part people usually saved. Not the holiday table. Not the porch picture. Not the birthday cake with everyone smiling toward the camera. This was the part after. The room after use. The visitor could feel that kind of after in the body. It was the feeling after walking out of the nursing home and sitting in the car for a minute before starting the engine. The feeling after signing the visitor log. After waving to the person at the front desk. After hearing the door click shut behind them, too gently for what it carried. No one usually saw that minute. The hands on the steering wheel. The quiet exhale. The small confusion of having been needed and useless at the same time. The wish to have brought more. The understanding that presence was sometimes the only thing left to bring. In this kitchen, that feeling did not have to explain itself. The quiet person beside the visitor shifted again, and the floor gave a small creak. It was the kind of sound old houses kept for themselves, a little reminder that someone had crossed this room many times before. Some footsteps had been rushed. Some angry. Some tired. Some careful late at night when everyone else was sleeping. The visitor glanced at the photo. The faces inside were younger than the bodies standing near it now. That was always the strange thing about family pictures. They kept one afternoon still while everything around them continued. Hair thinned. Knees became unreliable. Names slipped. Kitchens were remodeled, then worn down again. People moved away and came back with different voices. But the photo stayed simple. It did not mention the hard parts. It did not mention the missed calls, the stubborn silences, the ways love sometimes arrived late or dressed itself as duty. It did not mention the words that might have helped, if anyone had known how to say them then. Still, it held something true. Not the whole truth. Enough of it. The visitor felt tenderness rise again, not clean and easy, but warm in the way an old quilt can be warm even when the fabric is thin. Tenderness for the person standing nearby. Tenderness for the younger faces behind the glass. Tenderness for all the years when love had gone around the long way because it did not know the shorter path. Some people said very little because they had nothing to say. Some said very little because speech had never been the safest room in the house. The visitor did not turn that into a judgment. There was nothing useful about judging a silence after it had already shaped a family. It was simply there, in the room with them, like the hum of the refrigerator, like the dust at the edge of the frame, like the mail waiting to be sorted. The quiet person finally touched the corner of the frame. Only with 2 fingers. The touch was brief, almost uncertain. But the visitor saw it. The frame shifted less than an inch and settled back against the counter with a small sound. That was all. And it was not all. The visitor looked down, giving the moment a little privacy. There were crumbs near the base of the island. A faint ring where a glass had been set down and forgotten. The kind of marks that made a room feel less like a memory and more like a place people still had to live inside. Outside, the street kept moving. Someone drove by with music low enough to be only a pulse through the window. A truck slowed near the corner, then moved on. Sunday afternoon leaned toward evening without making any announcement. The quiet person's hand stayed near the frame. The visitor stood beside them, close but not crowding, carrying the soft ache of all the visits that had seemed too small to count. The nursing home hallways. The water cups. The folded blankets. The pauses no one thanked. Here, under one soft kitchen light, something in those pauses seemed to have a place to rest. There are some kinds of care that disappear almost as soon as they are given. A chair pulled closer. A sleeve straightened. A napkin folded once and placed beside a plate. The radio turned down because someone's eyes have grown tired. A question answered gently, even when the answer has already been given. The visitor knew those small things. At the nursing home, care often lived in gestures too brief for anyone to name. A hand on the back of a wheelchair while turning a corner. A blanket tucked around knees before a family member arrived. A nurse pausing at the door to listen before entering. Someone bending down to pick up a dropped sock, then going on with the day. The work kept moving. The thanks did not always come with it. Sometimes the people receiving care were too tired to say anything. Sometimes their minds were somewhere older. Sometimes families were carrying so much fear that gratitude could not find a clear place to stand. And sometimes no one was unkind at all. They were only busy, only worried, only trying to make it through another hour. Still, the visitor had learned what it felt like to be unseen. Not bitterly. Just quietly. That was why the old kitchen felt different. It held that same kind of invisible labor, but without pretending it had not happened. The worn island seemed to remember elbows, groceries, school forms, pill organizers, birthday candles, late bills, and the small private exhaustion that came after everyone else had been fed. The family photo frame sat in the middle of that remembering. The quiet person beside it looked smaller than the visitor remembered. Not only in body. In presence. As if years had folded them inward, making their silence even more noticeable. There had been a time when their quiet could fill a room with instruction. A look across the table. A cleared throat. A hand reaching for the check before anyone else could. Now the silence had changed. It was softer. The visitor stood beside them and felt the strange tenderness of seeing someone after the old roles had loosened. Parent, child, helper, guest, responsible one, difficult one, dependable one. All of those names were still somewhere in the room, but they did not seem as firm under the afternoon light. The refrigerator hummed. The frame held still. In the photo, one face had the half-smile of someone trying not to smile. Another face looked away. A shoulder leaned into another's shoulder. The whole picture seemed casual, almost careless, and maybe that was why it mattered. It had not been arranged to become important. It had simply survived long enough to be looked at this way. The visitor wondered who had taken it. Maybe someone no longer here. Maybe someone who stood behind the camera and said, "Come on, just one picture." Maybe someone who wanted proof that the family had gathered, even if the day itself had been messy. Proof could be a small thing. Paper behind glass. A moment kept because someone pressed a button. The quiet person's fingers moved along the edge of the frame, not lifting it. Just feeling the border. The visitor noticed the slow care in that touch, the way the hand followed the wood as if reading something through it. No words came. But the room did not feel empty. It felt like words had stepped aside. For a while, the visitor listened to the sounds that remained. The refrigerator. The faint passing of traffic. A pipe in the wall making one soft knock. The loose rhythm of someone breathing nearby. Chores half finished around them, patient in their own way. There would be time later to rinse the glass. There would be time later to fold the towel, close the cabinet, gather the mail, carry something back to its proper place. For now, the kitchen island under one soft light seemed to hold a pause the rest of the house had missed. And in that pause, love did not become easier. It only became visible. Not as a speech. Not as an apology. Not as anything polished enough to frame. It was standing close to someone who said very little. It was staying anyway. The visitor had once thought that memory lived mostly in stories. The ones told at the table. The ones repeated on holidays. The ones that began with, "Remember when," and then wandered through a room full of voices until someone corrected a detail and everyone laughed a little. Stories seemed to be the way families kept the past from slipping too far away. But standing there in the kitchen, beside someone who said almost nothing, the visitor felt memory moving without a story. It moved through the frame. Through the small weight of it on the island. Through the cloudy edge of the glass. Through the place where a thumb had rubbed the wood smooth over time. It moved through the soft light above them and the refrigerator hum beneath everything, steady as an old habit. The photo did not speak. Still, it brought people into the room. Not sharply. Not all at once. More like shadows returning to their familiar places. Someone near the stove. Someone leaning against the counter. Someone opening the refrigerator and standing there too long, letting the cold air spill out while deciding what they wanted. Someone calling from another room that the game was back on. The kitchen remembered them without making a scene. That was its way. The visitor looked at the quiet person and wondered how much of that room still lived clearly inside them. Maybe not in order. Maybe not with names placed neatly where they belonged. But perhaps the body remembered what the mouth could not gather. The height of the island. The shape of the light. The sound the refrigerator made before it clicked off. The exact distance between the counter and the sink. Some places stay in the hands. The quiet person's fingers rested near the frame again, and the visitor noticed how close memory and touch could become. There was no need to explain the photograph. No need to list who was in it or what year it had been. The frame seemed to do a quieter work than that. It allowed the past to come close without asking anyone to be ready for it. The visitor had seen that before. A resident in the nursing home touching the sleeve of an old cardigan. A woman holding a hairbrush she had used for years. A man turning a wedding band around his finger while looking out the window. Ordinary objects staying near people when sentences became difficult. A spoon. A sweater. A photo frame. Small things could carry a great deal, though they never asked to be called important. The visitor breathed in and noticed the kitchen smell beneath the afternoon stillness. Not fresh cooking. Not anything prepared for guests. Just the faint mixed scent of dish soap, old wood, and a room that had held many meals. It was the kind of smell that belonged to a house after use, when the work of living had left traces no one would point out. There was tenderness in that, too. Not the soft kind that came wrapped in perfect words. A rougher tenderness. One that had survived impatience, distance, tired mornings, stubborn habits, and all the things a family did not know how to say when there was still time to say them easily. The visitor did not try to fix that thought. It could sit there. On the island, the frame caught the light again, and the faces inside dimmed for a second behind the reflection. Then the glare shifted, and they returned. Young again. Still again. Waiting inside the small rectangle of one afternoon that had somehow outlasted so much noise. The quiet person looked down. The visitor looked down too. Neither of them needed to pretend the moment was simple. It was not. Love rarely was, especially the kind that had spent years disguising itself as work, worry, correction, errands, meals, bills, rides, and doors locked late at night. It could be clumsy. It could arrive without the sentence that would have made it easier to receive. But under that soft kitchen light, the visitor felt a quiet gratitude for it anyway. Not gratitude that erased anything. Only gratitude that noticed. That some form of love had been there, even when it did not know how to speak. That someone had kept coming into the kitchen. That someone had stood beside the island. That someone had taken the picture, or saved it, or wiped around it, or left it close enough for this afternoon. The refrigerator hummed on. The street outside kept moving. And in the part of the room no one photographed, the visitor stood beside the quiet person and let the memory pass through both of them without needing to catch it. The afternoon kept thinning around them. Not quickly. Not in a dramatic way. The light above the island stayed soft, but the edges of the kitchen had begun to look a little dimmer. The old cabinets held their shadows. The floor held the quiet marks of people coming and going. The window held the moving street beyond it, where other lives continued without knowing anything about this pause. The visitor felt the hour in a familiar place inside the body. That weekend heaviness. The chores not finished. The day not over. The thought of leaving soon, though no one had said it yet. A bag near the doorway. A jacket on the back of a chair. The small pull of another place waiting. Still, neither person moved. The quiet person remained beside the island, looking at the family photo frame as if the room had lowered its voice enough for something old to be heard. The visitor stood close by, close enough to notice the slight tremble in the hand, the careful breathing, the way the shoulders rested after years of holding themselves a certain way. There was no need to name it. Names could make some moments smaller. The visitor thought again of the nursing home, of rooms where people tried to carry love across distances that were not only physical. A chair pulled beside a bed. A window opened a few inches. A sweater brought from home because the one in the closet did not feel right. Someone saying, "I'm here," even when the person listening may or may not have understood the words. The words mattered. And also, something beneath them mattered. Showing up. Standing near. Letting the room be quiet without treating quiet as failure. Bringing the body into the room when the conversation had gone thin. Coming back after a visit that felt incomplete. Coming back again. That kind of care rarely made a sound. It was not the kind people photographed. Maybe that was why the part of the kitchen no one photographed felt like the right place for it. The island under one soft light. The crumbs. The mail. The half-finished cleanup. The photo frame close enough to touch. Nothing arranged. Nothing trying to look better than it was. The quiet person's hand left the edge of the frame and settled on the island. The visitor noticed the space where the fingers had been. The frame looked the same, and yet it did not. Something had passed through it. A memory, perhaps. Or only the feeling of being near what remained. Outside, a car slowed in front of the house, then continued on. The sound faded down the street. Somewhere, a neighbor's trash can lid closed with a hollow little knock. Ordinary sounds. Weekend sounds. The world making its small movements while this room stayed still. The refrigerator hummed again. This time the visitor heard it not as background, but as company. It had been there through meals no one remembered, arguments no one wanted to repeat, birthdays, illnesses, rushed mornings, late returns, and the slow changing of people who still belonged to each other in ways they could not always explain. The family photo frame stayed nearby. It did not solve anything. It only held a small piece of what had been true. A gathering. A day. Faces turned toward whoever stood behind the camera. A family, imperfect and real, kept inside paper and glass long after the voices had changed. The visitor felt gratitude, but not the bright kind that asks to be announced. It was quieter than that. A tenderness for love that had sometimes missed its chance to speak clearly, but had still washed dishes, driven across town, paid attention to prescriptions, carried bags, stood in doorways, and waited beside chairs. A tenderness for all the care that had gone unnamed, and all the care still happening now, in the pause no one else would see. The quiet person looked away from the frame at last. Not far. Only toward the dimmer part of the kitchen, where the room opened toward the hall. The visitor followed the glance and felt the moment beginning to loosen, the way visits do before anyone says goodbye. For one more breath, they stood there together. The house was quiet enough to notice. And what it noticed was not perfect love. Only love that had stayed near. Later, the kitchen would return to its small duties. Someone would rinse the glass in the sink. Someone would fold the dish towel and push in the chair. The mail would be sorted, or left for another day. The frame would remain on the island, a little closer to the soft light than before. But for now, nothing moved. The visitor stood beside the quiet person and felt the room holding them both with a patience no one had asked from it. The old kitchen had known so many versions of this family. Loud ones. Tired ones. Hungry ones. Younger ones. Ones that did not yet understand how quickly a day could become memory. The photo stayed there. Paper behind glass. A small proof that people had once gathered in this room, or near it, carrying all their unfinished ways of loving. Not always gentle. Not always clear. Not always able to say what would have helped. Still, something had been given. A meal. A ride. A hand near the counter. A visit. A silence kept company. A person standing beside another person at 3:54 on a weekend afternoon, while the street outside kept going. The refrigerator hummed softly. The quiet person breathed beside the island. And the visitor did not try to turn the moment into anything larger than it was. It was only this, a house grown quiet enough to notice the love that had stayed nearby, even when it had no words ready. The frame held the light. The room held the pause. And no one hurried to leave.